I never thought I would smile when my husband spat in my face, but as Thomas's warm, sticky saliva trickled down my cheek, a strange sensation washed over me. Not humiliation, but relief. The spit was still wet on my cheek when I heard the applause. Three pairs of hands clapping in perfect unison, as if they had rehearsed this moment. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, sat in her favorite armchair, with that satisfied smile I'd learned to fear over the past 12 years. Jessica, my sister-in-law, lounged on the couch like she was watching her favorite television show. And Thomas, the man I'd married, loved, and supported through everything, stood there with his face twisted in disgust, looking at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. I smiled as I walked out of the room, leaving three confused faces behind. They didn't know that within the next 24 hours, all three would lose everything: their freedom, their reputation, and the illusion of power they'd built their lives around. How does a marriage of 12 years end with such an act? And why did I feel not pain, but relief? I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. Charlotte, North Carolina, is a city where tradition and modernity collide. Stately historic homes stand alongside gleaming glass towers. Old money mingles with new ambition. It was in this city, in a neighborhood of graceful oak trees and well-preserved Victorian houses, that I lived what appeared to be a charmed life. Strange how you can become a completely different person without even noticing. The confident woman I once was had faded into a shadow, constantly apologizing for taking up space. "You're being oversensitive again, Emily," Thomas would say whenever I questioned something he did. His voice always took on that particular tone, patient but edged with irritation, as if explaining something to a slow child. Thomas Wilson worked at one of Charlotte's most prestigious accounting firms, tall and distinguished with prematurely silver-streaked dark hair. He commanded respect everywhere he went, but sometimes I caught him staring at his phone, wearing the expression of a frightened boy about to be scolded by his mother. "Eleanor's expecting us at 7, he'd say, that familiar anxiety creeping into his voice. "We can't be late." The contradictions in Thomas confused me for years. He could caress me tenderly in the morning and look at me with contempt by evening, especially after Eleanor called. His mood swung like a pendulum, but always in time with his mother's expectations. Eleanor Wilson was a force in Charlotte society. At 68, she maintained the kind of polished appearance that took both time and money. Her silver hair always perfectly coiffed. Her clothes expensive but conservative. She volunteered at the church charity drives and hosted the most elegant Christmas parties in the neighborhood. No one would have guessed she was the architect of my destruction. "Emily just isn't as organized as I was at her age," she'd say at family gatherings, her voice sweet with false concern. "But we love her anyway, don't we?" Eleanor had survived a marriage to a controlling, abusive husband. Instead of breaking the cycle, she had perfected it. In rare, unguarded moments, I'd catch a glimpse of pain in her eyes when she looked at old photographs. Was she wondering how her life might have been different? Then there was Jessica, Thomas's older sister, 47, divorced, bitter, and permanently fixed in her mother's orbit. Jessica had once had a chance at happiness with a kind man named Richard, but Eleanor had systematically sabotaged the relationship. Now Jessica had become her mother's copy, determined to make other women suffer as she did. "God, Emily, are you wearing that to the club?" Jessica would ask, eyebrows raised. Bold choice. The Wilson family had perfected the art of the subtle dig, the comment that could be defended as innocent while slicing deep beneath the skin. It began with small comments. "That blouse doesn't really flatter you, darling. That story's a bit boring, sweetheart." Each one delivered with a smile, each one chipping away at my confidence. Then came financial control. "Let me handle the money. You're not good with these things." Thomas took over our accounts, giving me an allowance like a child. Finally, social isolation. "Your friends don't really understand our family dynamic." One by one, my friendships withered as I had less time, less freedom, and eventually less of myself to give. The historic Victorian home in Charlotte's Elizabeth neighborhood had been my grandmother's gift to me. Thomas moved in after our wedding, and Eleanor always regarded it as a trophy she needed to conquer. Over time, I lost control of my own house. The blue walls I loved were painted beige because Eleanor thought blue was depressing. The antique furniture my grandmother had cherished was replaced with Eleanor's choices because they were more appropriate. I'd become a guest in my own home, tiptoeing through rooms that no longer felt like mine. The first sign that something was truly deeply wrong came 4 months ago. I was washing dishes when my phone rang a number I didn't recognize. "Is Tommy coming over tonight?" A woman's breathy voice asked. "Daniel's working late again." My hand froze on a half-washed plate. "I think you have the wrong number." A pause, then a laugh. "Oh, is this the wife? How embarrassing." I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp anger spread through me, an emotion I had forgotten how to feel. That night, as Thomas slept beside me, probably dreaming about his affair, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every cruel calculation that had brought me to this point. The investigation was easier than I'd expected. Thomas was careless, overconfident. He kept his phone unlocked around me because he'd trained me so well not to question him. His computer password was our wedding anniversary, a detail that would have been touching if he weren't using that computer to coordinate his betrayal. What I found in his digital life made me physically sick. Not just the affair, though that was devastating enough, but the conversations with his mother and sister, planning ways to make me more manageable. "Thomas, she's asking questions about the credit card bill again." "Eleanor, just tell her it's complicated business expenses. She never understood finances anyway." "Jessica, remember how Dad used to handle Mom when she got too nosy? There were text threads going back years where they were strategized about isolating me from my friends." "Eleanor, I saw Emily talking to Caroline at church again. That woman has been divorced twice. Not a good influence." "Thomas, I'll handle it." The most chilling discovery was their long-term financial plan. "Eleanor, once we get her name off the house deed, we'll have more options." "Thomas, she'll never agree to that." "Eleanor, she will if she thinks it's her idea, or if she's too broken down to fight it. They had been planning to take my home, my grandmother's legacy all along." That night, I called my brother Robert, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Rob, I need help," I whispered, constantly checking to ensure Thomas couldn't overhear. "Emily, what's wrong?" The concern in his voice almost broke me. I told him everything: the affair, the emotional abuse, the plans I'd discovered. There was a long silence when I finished. "Emily, this isn't your fault," Robert said firmly. "None of this is your fault, but we're going to make sure they face consequences for what they've done." I hadn't known then that Robert, a successful divorce attorney, would become my salvation. He connected me with a discreet private investigator who specialized in domestic cases. What we uncovered shocked even Robert. The affair with Megan Carter wasn't Thomas's first infidelity. There had been at least 5 serious affairs over the past 8 years, all following the same pattern of manipulation and deception. Even worse, we discovered Eleanor hadn't just enabled Thomas's affairs, she had actively helped orchestrate them. She'd created a private Facebook group called Marriage Support Network that claimed to help women with marital difficulties. In reality, it was a hunting ground where Eleanor and Jessica identified vulnerable women whose husbands traveled frequently or who seemed isolated from their families. "She's actually coaching him on how to manage multiple relationships," the investigator explained, showing me text messages between Thomas and his mother. "She's helping him keep track of his lies." The most damning evidence came when we discovered their financial motivations. They weren't just trying to control me, they were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent to take control of my grandmother's trust fund, which matured on my 45th birthday, just 6 months away. "They've been laying the groundwork for years," Robert explained grimly. "Isolating you, airlighting you, creating a narrative of your instability they could present to a judge." I made a decision that night that changed everything. I would pretend nothing had changed. I would continue to play the role of the broken, submissive wife while methodically building a case that would destroy them. For 3 months, I lived a double life. Every insult I absorbed, every humiliation I endured, every time I bit my tongue when they treated me like garbage, it was all leading to the moment when I would finally break free. Each time Thomas criticizes you, I want you to remember you're gathering evidence. Robert coached me. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Just make a mental note and write it down later. I became an actress in my own life, playing the role of a woman they thought they had broken. When Thomas criticized, I lowered my head and apologized. When Eleanor commanded, I obeyed. When Jessica mocked, I remained silent. But behind that submission was a storm brewing. I placed small recording devices throughout the house under the coffee table, behind books on shelves, in the kitchen drawer. I documented every conversation, every cruel comment, every manipulation. I learned about family law from Robert, understanding my rights and preparing for the battle ahead. I set up a separate bank account that only Robert and I knew about, gradually moving small amounts of money where Thomas wouldn't notice. I faced my first challenge when Thomas discovered one of the recording devices under the coffee table. My heart stopped as he held it up, confusion on his face. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. I summoned tears not difficult given the circumstances. "It's a memory aid," I said, my voice trembling. "I've been so forgetful lately, missing appointments, forgetting to do things you ask. I thought if I recorded reminders for myself." For a moment, Thomas looked almost concerned, asking if I was feeling all right. I nearly wavered, seeing a glimpse of the man I'd once loved. Then his phone lit up with a message from Megan, and the moment passed. An unexpected ally appeared one rainy afternoon when Thomas's Uncle James showed up at our door. James Wilson was the black sheep of the family, the younger brother of Thomas's father who had distanced himself from Eleanor years ago. "I need to speak with Emily," he told Thomas firmly. "Alone." In the privacy of the garden, James handed me a small box. "Eleanor did to my marriage what she's doing to yours," he said quietly. I couldn't stop her then, but I've kept these all these years, waiting for someone brave enough to use them. Inside the box were journals belonging to Thomas's father, detailing Eleanor's manipulations going back decades. Page after page described how she had systematically isolated him from friends and family, controlled their finances, and even encouraged his affairs as a way to keep him destabilized and dependent on her approval. "This is generational," James said. "Eleanor learned these tactics from her own mother. She taught them to Thomas and Jessica. The cycle needs to end." The financial challenges began a few weeks before everything came to a head. Thomas started restricting my access to our accounts even further. "We need to tighten our belts," he said. Though nothing about his or Eleanor's lifestyle had changed, they were preparing for something, putting pressure on me as my grandmother's trust approached maturity. I felt like a spy in my own home, secretly preparing for the day when I would no longer need to hide. The argument that led to that fateful moment when Thomas spat in my face started over something so trivial, I could barely remember what it was. Something about dinner plans for Eleanor's birthday. "I think we should have dinner at a restaurant instead of me cooking for 15 people. I said, the first time in months I'd opposed one of Eleanor's decisions. Such a simple statement, but to Eleanor, it was an act of rebellion she couldn't forgive. "After everything we've done for you," Eleanor said, her voice cold with displeasure, "this is how you show gratitude." "It's just a suggestion," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. I thought it might be less stressful for everyone. "Stress," Jessica laughed. "What would you know about stress? You don't even work." I didn't mention that I'd stopped working at their insistence years ago. I didn't point out that managing the house exactly to Eleanor's specifications was a full-time job itself. I just stood there, taking their barbs as I had for years. Then Thomas stepped forward, his face darkening with each step. The room went quiet. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, an expectant gleam in her eyes. Jessica smirked, settling back as if preparing for a show. Without warning, without escalation, Thomas leaned in and spat directly in my face. A deliberate, calculated humiliation. The moisture ran down my cheek as I stood there, frozen. In 12 years of marriage, through all the gradual changes, through all the small cruelties that had become our normal, nothing had prepared me for this moment. This wasn't anger. This was contempt so complete that I ceased to exist as a human being in his eyes. That's what happens when you don't know your place, Jessica added, examining her perfectly manicured nails. Maybe now she'll learn to keep her mouth shut. My place, I almost laughed at the irony. They had no idea what my place actually was. I didn't wipe my face, I didn't cry, I didn't scream or fight back or do any of the things a normal person might do when their spouse publicly humiliates them in the most degrading way possible. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't even an angry smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game was finally over. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly, my voice steady despite everything. "Everyone should know their place." Thomas looked confused. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd grown accustomed to my tears, my apologies, my desperate attempts to smooth things over and restore peace. But that woman, the one who apologized for existing, who made herself smaller and smaller to accommodate their growing cruelty, she had died the moment his saliva hit my face. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back. Behind me, I could hear them whispering, probably planning their next move in this twisted game they had been playing with my life. What they didn't know was that I'd figured out the rules months ago. In the kitchen, I pulled out my phone with hands that weren't shaking. That surprised me. I thought they would be shaking. I thought I'd be falling apart right now. Instead, I felt calmer than I had in years. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Robert Anderson, attorney. My brother answered on the first ring. "It's time, Akbayat," I said simply. "Are you sure?" His voice was gentle but professional. We'd had this conversation before, planned for this moment. He spat in my face. "Rob," in front of his mother and sister. They clapped. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Robert spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't say anything else to them. Don't explain. Don't argue. Don't apologize. Just wait." "I've been waiting for 3 months," I reminded him. "I know, and now it's over." I hung up and stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for people who saw me as a servant, where I'd cleaned up after gatherings I wasn't really invited to join, where I'd swallowed my pride so many times I'd forgotten what it tasted like. The house was eerily quiet now. No more whispered conversations from the living room. No more satisfied laughter. Just silence. I walked back toward the living room, and that's when I saw them. All three of them were standing in the hallway, their faces pale, staring at me like they'd seen a ghost. "Who did you call?" Thomas's voice had lost all its earlier bravado. I didn't answer. I just walked past them to the front window and looked out at the street. A black sedan was already pulling into our driveway. "Emily?" Eleanor's voice was sharp now, worried. "Who did you call?" I turned to face the men, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished version of myself I'd become, but the woman I used to be. The woman who had opinions and boundaries and the strength to enforce them. "I called someone who knows exactly where everyone's place is," I said. The doorbell rang, and the sound seemed to echo through the house like thunder. Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica all looked toward the door, then back at me, then at each other. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked uncertain. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I asked pleasantly. "It's your house, after all." Thomas moved toward the door with reluctant steps, like a man walking toward his own execution. When he opened it, Robert stepped inside, briefcase in hand, wearing the kind of expression that had made him one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state. "Good evening," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm Robert Anderson, and I represent Mrs. Emily Anderson, and I have some documents that require your immediate attention. The transformation in the room was instantaneous. Eleanor, who had been so confident and smug just moments before, seemed to shrink into herself. Jessica's face had gone completely white. And Thomas, my husband who had humiliated me, who had spat in my face like I was nothing, looked like he was about to be sick. Documents, he managed to croak. Robert opened his briefcase with deliberate precision. Divorce papers, restraining order, and a few other items that I think will be of particular interest to everyone here. He handed Thomas a thick stack of papers, then turned to Eleanor and Jessica, giving them each their own sets of documents. Ladies, he said with cold politeness, you're also named in several of these proceedings. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 3 rooms away. This was the moment I'd been working toward for 3 months. Ever since I'd finally admitted to myself that my marriage wasn't just troubled, it was abusive. Not just physically abusive, though tonight had crossed even that line, but emotionally, systematically, deliberately abusive. They had spent years breaking me down, making me question my own worth, my own sanity, my own right to exist in spaces they deemed theirs. What they didn't know was that for the past 3 months, I'd been documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every manipulation, every time they had isolated me from friends or made decisions about our shared life without consulting me. I'd recorded conversations, saved text messages, and built a case that would ensure I never had to apologize for breathing again. Robert looked around the room with the satisfied expression of a man who had just delivered exactly the kind of justice his client deserved. Mrs. Anderson, he said, turning to me, shall we discuss the timeline for your transition to your new living arrangements? I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. 3 months of planning, 3 months of secret meetings and careful documentation, 3 months of pretending to be the same broken woman they thought they'd created. And it had all led to this moment. Behind me, I could hear Thomas frantically flipping through pages, his breathing getting faster and more panicked with each document he read. Eleanor was clutching her papers like they might disappear if she let go. Jessica was just staring at her set, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. There must be some mistake, Thomas finally said, his voice high and desperate. She couldn't. Oh, but she did, Robert replied smoothly. Mrs. Anderson has been quite thorough in her preparations. I think you'll find everything is very much in order. I looked at the 3 people who had made my life a misery, who had convinced me I was worthless, who had celebrated my humiliation just minutes before. They looked so small now, so powerless, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. As I walked out the door with Robert, I paused and turned back. I didn't wipe the spit from my face. I wanted them to see what they had done and what it had cost them. I didn't leave because you were cruel, I said softly. I left because I finally remembered who I am. The door closed behind us, and I stepped into the cool evening air of Charlotte, feeling, for the first time in 12 years, like I was walking towards something rather than away from it. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room for the first time in 12 years. The sheets were crisp and white, untouched by the weight of someone else's expectations. For a moment, before memory crashed back, I felt peaceful. Then I remembered Thomas's face when Robert had handed him those papers. The way his hands had trembled as he read through document after document, each one more damaging than the last. The way Eleanor had sunk deeper into her chair with every page she turned. The way Jessica had gone completely silent. Her usual stream of cutting remarks dried up like a poisoned well. My phone buzzed with texts I didn't bother to read. I knew what they said. Apologies, explanations, promises that things would be different. The same lies I'd been hearing for years, just delivered with more desperation. Robert had instructed me not to respond to any contact from them. Let them sweat, he'd said as he drove me to the hotel last night. Let them wonder exactly how much you know and how much evidence you have. The truth was, I had more than they could possibly imagine. It had started 4 months ago with that phone call that was meant for Thomas. A woman's voice, breathy and intimate, asking if Tommy was coming over tonight because her husband was working late again. That single moment had shattered the last of my illusions about my marriage. Not because Thomas was having an affair somewhere deep down. I think I'd always known, but because of how the woman on the phone had spoken about me. Like I was a joke. Like I was something to be pitied and dismissed. I'd hung up without saying another word, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I got angry. Really, truly angry. Not the quiet resentment I'd been carrying, but clean, bright fury that cut through all the fog of self-doubt they'd created around me. Scrolling through my notifications, I noticed a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. When I played it, my stomach clenched. "Mrs. Anderson, this is Daniel Carter. I believe we have something to discuss regarding our spouses. Call me back at this number." Megan's husband had found out. I wondered if Thomas had already told him some fabricated story about me, painting me as unstable or vindictive. That had been their strategy for years: control the narrative, isolate me, make me seem unreliable before I could tell my truth. Not anymore until I called Robert. "I've got some news," he said before I could even mention Daniel's call. "Thomas tried to access your joint accounts this morning. He transferred everything to his personal account, or tried to. The bank froze the transfers when they received our legal notice." "So I still have access to our money?" I asked, relief washing over me. "Not exactly. The accounts are frozen pending court review, standard procedure in contentious divorces, but he can't drain them either. I've filed for emergency spousal support given the circumstances." I felt a moment of panic. "So I have nothing. You have the emergency fund we set up. It should cover your expenses for at least a month, and I've paid for the hotel through next week." My brother was right, but the financial reality was still jarring. After 12 years of marriage, despite my name on accounts with substantial balances, I was temporarily broke. It was exactly the situation Eleanor had wanted me: independent, vulnerable, easy to control. Except this time, I wasn't alone. "There's more," Robert continued. "The initial hearing for the restraining orders is set for tomorrow morning. The judge will decide whether to extend them past the emergency period." "Do I need to be there?" "Yes, and Emily, they'll be there too." The thought of seeing Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica so soon sent a wave of nausea through me. But I'd faced them at their worst last night. I could face them in a courtroom, with a judge present and my brother at my side. "I'll be ready," I promised. As I hung up, I noticed an email notification. The sender was Megan Carter. "Emily, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you deleted it without opening. But I need to tell you something important. Thomas has been lying to both of us. He told me your marriage was over in everything but name, that you had both agreed to see other people discreetly. He showed me text messages, supposedly from you, giving your blessing. I never would have gotten involved with him if I'd thought he was lying about your situation. I'm not a homewrecker. I'm a fool who believed a convincing liar. My husband found out yesterday. Our marriage is over. But before I try to rebuild my life, I want to help you if I can. Thomas didn't just betray you with me. There were others before me, and I suspect he was still seeing at least one of them while telling me I was the only one. If you're willing to talk, I have information that might help your case against him." "Megan," I stared at the screen, absorbing the implications. Thomas hadn't just cheated on me, he cheated on his mistress too. And apparently there were others. How many women had he manipulated? How many lives had he disrupted with his lies? I forwarded the email to Robert with a simple note. Should I respond? His reply came minutes later. "Yes, but carefully. Suggest meeting at my office tomorrow after the hearing. I want to vet her information directly." I sent Megan a brief, neutral reply agreeing to meet, then turned my attention to preparing for the next day's court appearance. I needed to look strong, composed, and saying everything they had tried to convince me and others that I wasn't. I spent the afternoon shopping for a new outfit, something Eleanor would never have approved of, a tailored navy suit that made me look professional and confident. For years, she had pushed me toward floral dresses and soft pastels, clothes that made me look younger and more vulnerable than I was. Those severe lines don't flatter you, dear, she'd say about anything structured or bold. As I studied my reflection in the dressing room mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because the suit was so different from my usual wardrobe, though it was, but because the woman looking back at me had a straight spine and clear eyes. She looked like someone who knew her own mind. I bought the suit. The county courthouse was an imposing neoclassical building in downtown Charlotte, all columns and granite steps designed to intimidate. As Robert and I climbed those steps the next morning, I spotted them immediately: Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica huddled with their attorney, a sharp-faced woman I recognized as Catherine Walsh, one of Charlotte's most aggressive divorce lawyers. "Don't engage," Robert murmured, guiding me with a light touch on my elbow. "Let them make the first mistake." We were nearly at the doors when Thomas broke away from his group and intercepted us. "Emily, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. His usually impeccable appearance had slipped. His hair was uncombed, his tie slightly askew. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Mr. Wilson," Robert said firmly, "any communication with my client should go through me." "This is between me and my wife," Thomas snapped, color rising in his face. "Ex-wife," I corrected quietly. "And Robert is right, we have nothing to discuss outside of court." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes: shock. Maybe, or the first dawning realization that he couldn't charm or bully his way out of this situation. "This has gotten out of hand," he said, his voice taking on that familiar, patronizing tone. "I know we've had our problems, but divorce criminal charges, Emily. This is insane." "Is it?" I took another sip of composure. "Which part seems insane to you, Thomas? The part where you spat in my face, or the part where you and your family spent years systematically destroying my self-worth while laughing about it behind my back?" His face flushed. "Those recordings, you can't use those. Recording people without their consent is illegal." I almost smiled. Eleanor had clearly done some research and fed him this line. "Actually, in North Carolina, only one party needs to consent to a recording, since I was present for every conversation I recorded. They're perfectly legal." The color drained from his face. "You planned this. All of it. You've been planning to destroy me." "No, Thomas. I plan to save myself. There's a difference." He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with so many years ago, before his mother had convinced him that loving me was a weakness, before he'd learned that cruelty could be disguised as strength. "Emily, I know I've made mistakes. We all have. But we're family. Families work through problems together. They don't destroy each other in court." "Family." I repeated the word like it was foreign. "Thomas, do you remember what your mother said when she found out I'd had a miscarriage 3 years ago?" His eyes darted away from mine. Of course he remembered. "She said it was probably for the best, since I'd probably just raise another weakling anyway. And you, my husband, the father of that lost baby, you just sat there and nodded. Mom was upset. Your mother was cruel, and you enabled her cruelty because it was easier than standing up for your wife." I set my jaw. That's when I should have left, but I stayed because I thought families work through problems together. I thought if I just tried harder, loved you more, made myself smaller, eventually you'd choose me over her. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I did love you, Emily. I still do." "No," I said firmly. "You loved having someone to blame for everything wrong in your life. You loved having someone who would absorb your mother's poison so you didn't have to deal with her yourself. You loved having a scapegoat." "That's not true." I pulled out my phone and opened the audio app. Would you like me to play the recording from last month where you told your mother that you sometimes wonder if you'd be happier if I just disappeared? Or maybe the one where Jessica suggested you could probably get me committed if I became too much trouble. He went completely still. You don't have a recording of that, but I did, and we both knew it. I'd been into the bathroom when that particular conversation happened, and I'd left the recorder on the coffee table. The audio quality was perfect. Thomas, let me make something very clear to you. For 3 months, I documented everything, every conversation, every text message, every email. I have recordings of your mother coaching you on how to gaslight me. I have evidence of the credit card she opened in my name. I have proof of your affair, including hotel receipts and photos Megan sent you that I found on your phone. His hands were shaking now. Emily, if this gets out, my job, my reputation, should have thought of that before you decided to humiliate me in front of your family. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean, did things I regret. But destroying my entire life isn't going to fix anything. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of the years of pain he'd caused. What I saw instead was the same selfish panic I'd seen the night Robert served the papers. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done to me. He was sorry he was facing consequences. Your life isn't destroyed, Thomas. It's just finally being exposed for what it really is. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert, who had stepped away to give us privacy while remaining within eyesight. Daniel Carter is filing for divorce today, all over social media. His family owns Carter Financial Group, Thomas's biggest client. I showed the message to Thomas, watching his face go ashen. "Oh God," he whispered. "Daniel knows." Daniel Carter was a prominent local businessman, the kind of man whose social circle overlaps significantly with Thomas's professional network, the kind of man who wouldn't quietly tolerate being made a fool of. Apparently, Daniel hired his own private investigator when he got suspicious, found everything we found, plus some things we missed. I put my phone away. Did you really think you could carry on an affair for months in a town this size without consequences? This is going to destroy everything. My job, my standing in the community. Your job at the accounting firm that handles Daniel Carter's business interests? I asked. Yes, I imagine that might become awkward. He looked up sharply. How did you, Thomas? You never were as careful as you thought you were, and you certainly never paid attention to what I actually knew about your life. I glanced over his shoulder and saw Catherine Walsh gesturing impatiently. The hearing would start soon. You all made the mistake of assuming I was stupid just because I was kind. You confused silence with ignorance, submission with weakness. Emily, please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I'll cut off contact with my mother and sister if that's what it takes. For just a moment, I wavered. This was what I'd wanted for so many years, for him to choose me, to put our marriage first, to acknowledge that his family's treatment of me was wrong. But it was too late. Much too late. You can't cut off contact with your mother and sister, Thomas, because in about 2 hours, they're both going to be arrested. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Thomas's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Arrested, he finally managed. Eleanor for identity theft and credit fraud. The credit cards she opened in my name constitute felony fraud. Jessica for conspiracy and harassment. It turns out there are laws against coordinating campaigns to isolate and emotionally abuse family members. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Robert filed the charges yesterday. The police are serving warrants this morning. Thomas stood up so quickly his balance wavered. Emily, you can't do this. They're family. They're all the family I have left. They're criminals, Thomas. And they're not my family. They never were. My mother is 72 years old. You want to send a 72-year-old woman to jail. I want a 72-year-old woman to face consequences for her actions. Age doesn't excuse cruelty, and it certainly doesn't excuse fraud. He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something, some way to fix this. I'll pay back the money. I'll make them apologize. With what money you're about to lose your job. Remember, and apologies don't undo years of systematic abuse. My phone rang Robert's name on the screen. Excuse me, I said to Thomas and answered. Hi, Robert. It's done. Both arrests went smoothly. Eleanor tried to claim she was too fragile for handcuffs, but apparently that didn't work. Jessica demanded to speak to her lawyer, which is funny since she's about to discover her lawyer has a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest. Daniel Carter uses the same firm. They can't represent Jessica in a case where their primary client is the wrong party. I looked at Thomas, who was watching me with desperate eyes, trying to read my expression. Thank you, I told Robert. I'll call you later. When I hung up, Thomas was staring at me like I was a stranger. It's done, I said simply. Emily, please. No. No. The word came out harder than I'd intended. No more pleading, no more begging, no more making excuses for people who never showed me an ounce of genuine respect. I picked up my purse and started toward the courthouse doors, where Robert was waiting. Where are you going? Thomas called after me. To see the judge. We have a lot of paperwork to finalize. Emily, wait. What about us? What about our marriage? 12 years can't just disappear because of one mistake. I stopped and turned back to him. He was standing in the middle of the courthouse plaza, looking lost and broken and utterly bewildered by the collapse of the world he'd built on my suffering. One mistake, I said quietly. Thomas, spitting in my face wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable result of 12 years of treating me like I didn't matter. It was what you'd always wanted to do, and you finally worked up the courage to do it. That's not true. Yes, it is, and deep down, you know it is. Just like you know that your mother and sister are getting exactly what they deserve. Just like you know that Daniel Carter has every right to destroy your career over what you did to his marriage. I turned back toward the courthouse, then paused. You want to know this truth, Thomas. The real truth about our marriage, I stopped loving you 2 years ago. The night you laughed when your mother called me pathetic. The night you agreed with her that I was lucky anyone would have me. I died a little that night, and I've been dying a little more every day since. Robert held the door open for me. But I'm not dying anymore, I said as I walked away. For the first time in years, I'm finally alive. The hearing was brief and went exactly as Robert had predicted. The judge extended the restraining orders against Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica for 6 months and scheduled the first divorce hearing for the following month. Thomas sat slumped in his chair, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear throughout the proceedings. Afterward, Robert drove me to his office for the meeting with Megan Carter. I wasn't sure what to expect: anger, blame, or perhaps a woman desperate to salvage her own marriage by throwing me under the bus. What I found instead was someone who looked as shell-shocked as I felt. Megan was younger than I'd expected from the photos I'd seen on Thomas's phone, probably early 30s, with a kind of polished appearance that came from having both time and money to maintain it. Mrs. Anderson, she said softly when Robert showed her into the conference room. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I gestured for her to sit. I think under the circumstances you should call me Emily. She nodded, fidgeting with her purse strap. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but there are things about Thomas, about the whole situation, that you don't know. Things I think you deserve to hear. Robert took a seat beside me, legal pad ready. Whatever you have to share, Ms. Carter, we'd appreciate it. Megan took a deep breath. I brought you something. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse. Photos, text messages, emails, evidence that might help your case. I took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. Why would you help me? You're the one who was sleeping with my husband. Megan's face crumpled. No, I'm not. That's what I came to tell you. I didn't destroy your marriage. Mrs. Emily, Thomas did, and he destroyed mine too. She sat down heavily, looking suddenly much older than her years. I need to start from the beginning because what you think happened between Thomas and me, it's not the whole truth. I remained cautious, arms crossed, waiting. 6 months ago, I was having problems in my marriage. Daniel and I were seeing a counselor, trying to work through some issues. Thomas was a neighbor's friend, and he seemed so understanding, so sympathetic. He told me his marriage was over, that you two were just staying together for appearances. That's a lie. I know that now. But at the time, he was very convincing. He said you'd grown apart, that you barely spoke anymore, that you'd both agreed the marriage was dead, but neither of you wanted to go through the hassle of divorce. I felt a familiar flash of anger. Even in his affair, Thomas had been rewriting our history to make himself the victim. He showed me text messages, Megan continued, conversations that he claimed were between the two of you, where you both agreed to see other people discreetly until you could figure out the logistics of separating. He forged text messages. I think so. I mean, I never questioned them at the time because they seemed to fit with everything else he was telling me. He was so detailed about your supposed arrangement, so matter-of-fact about it. Megan opened her purse and pulled out her phone. But then last week, after Daniel found out and confronted me, I started really thinking about those messages, and I realized I'd never actually seen them on your phone. Thomas always showed them to me on his phone, claiming he'd screenshotted them. She handed me her phone, showing me a series of text messages, allegedly from me to Thomas. These aren't from me, I said immediately. Look at the phone number. That's not even my number. I know. I figured that out when I tried to look up the number online. It doesn't exist. Thomas created fake conversations to convince me you were okay with the affair. The calculation behind that deception was breathtaking. Thomas hadn't just cheated. He'd constructed an elaborate lie to manipulate Megan into participating in his betrayal. There's more, Megan said quietly. Remember that weekend you went to visit your sister about 3 months ago? I nodded. I'd gone to see my sister Karen in Baltimore, needing some space to process everything I'd learned about Thomas and his family. Thomas told me you were actually at a hotel with someone named Marcus. He said you'd finally started seeing someone too, and that you were probably going to ask for a divorce soon. My blood ran cold. Marcus is my brother-in-law. I was visiting my sister and her family. I know that now, but Thomas showed me hotel receipts with your name on them. Credit card statements on showing charges at romantic restaurants. He made it seem like you were having this passionate affair while he was stuck at home alone. Those were forged, too. They had to be, because I wasn't having an affair at all. I was just trying to survive what he and his family were doing to me. Megan's voice broke slightly. Emily, I need you to understand something. I'm not a homewrecker. I would never have gotten involved with a married man if I'd thought he was lying about his situation. When Thomas told me his marriage was over in everything but name, when he convinced me you were seeing someone else too, I thought we were all adults handling a difficult situation maturely. I started to see the scope of Thomas's manipulations. How did you find out the truth? After Daniel confronted me, I started questioning everything. I hired my own investigator, not to investigate you, but to investigate Thomas, to find out how much of what he told me was real. She gestured to the manila envelope I'd set aside. It's all in there. Evidence that Thomas has been running similar cons on other women for years. Before me, there was someone named Olivia. Before Olivia, there was Natalie. Always married women having problems in their relationships. Always women he could convince that everyone involved was okay with the arrangement. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and what looked like a detailed investigative report. Thomas is a serial cheater, Emily, and more than that, he's a serial manipulator. He specifically targets women who are vulnerable, tells them elaborate lies about his marriage, and convinces them they're not doing anything wrong. The first photo in the stack showed Thomas with a woman I didn't recognize, clearly taken at some kind of social event. They looked comfortable together, intimate. That's Olivia Barnes, Megan explained. She's married to a businessman who travels frequently. Thomas convinced her that you knew about their relationship and approved of it. When her husband found out and threatened to expose everything, Thomas simply vanished from her life and moved on to the next target. How many women? My investigator found evidence of at least widespread serious affairs over the past 8 years. Probably more casual ones that didn't leave as much of a paper trail. 8 years. I thought I'd been in a troubled marriage for the past few years, dealing with increasing hostility from Thomas and his family. But the truth was, I'd been married to a stranger, a predator who used women's vulnerabilities against them while systematically destroying his wife's self-worth at home. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why help me?" Megan was quiet for a long moment. "Because Thomas destroyed my marriage, too. Daniel is filing for divorce, and he's making sure everyone in our social circle knows what I did. My reputation is ruined. My children are ashamed of me, and I'm going to lose half of everything I have." She wiped her eyes. "But the worst part isn't the social consequences or the financial cost. The worst part is knowing that I helped him hurt you, that I was part of the system he used to justify treating you like garbage." I looked through more of the photographs Thomas with different women, always looking relaxed and happy in a way I rarely saw at home. "There's something else," Megan said. "Something about his mother and sister that you need to know." "What about them?" "They knew about all of it." My investigator found text messages between Thomas and Eleanor where she's actually coaching him on how to manage multiple relationships. She was helping him keep track of his lies. The room seemed to spin around me. "Eleanor knew about your affair. She knew about all the affairs. She encouraged them. There are messages where she's telling Thomas that having other women will help him keep you in line because you'll be too insecure and jealous to make demands on him." I thought about all the times Eleanor had made subtle comments about my appearance, my desirability, my worthiness as a wife, comments designed to make me feel like I should be grateful that Thomas stayed with me at all. "Jessica was involved too," Megan continued. "She helped Thomas create fake social media profiles to communicate with his targets. She was the one who came up with the story about you having an affair with Marcus." The systematic nature of their conspiracy was overwhelming. It wasn't just that they'd been cruel to me, they'd been actively working to destroy my sanity and self-worth while enabling Thomas's betrayals. "Emily, I know this doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo the damage that's been done to your life or mine. But I wanted you to know that what happened to you wasn't random cruelty or a marriage that just went wrong. It was deliberate, calculated psychological warfare." I set down the photographs, my hands trembling. They planned all of it. The isolation, the gaslighting, the affairs. They turned my marriage into a weapon against me. Yes, and they've been doing it for years. Probably to every woman Thomas has ever been with. Seriously. My investigator thinks Eleanor might have had similar arrangements with Thomas's father before he died. There are hints in some old family letters that suggest a pattern going back decades. The thought that this might be generational, that Eleanor had perhaps orchestrated similar psychological torture against other women in her family, made me physically sick. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I'm going to testify in your divorce proceedings if your lawyer wants me to. I'm going to provide whatever evidence I have to help you get justice, and then I'm going to try to rebuild my life and figure out how to earn my children's forgiveness." She stood up, smoothing down her skirt with nervous hands. "I know you have no reason to forgive me, Emily. I know I was part of something that nearly destroyed you, even if I didn't understand what I was participating in at the time, but I want you to know that Thomas never deserved you. And what his family did to you, it's criminal. Not just legally, but morally." After she left, I sat in Robert's quiet office, surrounded by evidence of my husband's systematic betrayal. Not just the affair I discovered, but years of affairs, years of manipulation, years of using other women's pain to justify his cruelty toward me. The man I'd been married to for 12 years didn't exist. He'd never existed. The person I'd loved, made excuses for, and tried so desperately to please had been an elaborate fiction designed to hide a predator. But as devastating as that realization was, it was also liberating because it meant that nothing that had happened to me was my fault. I hadn't failed as a wife. I'd been the victim of a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological abuse. And now I had the evidence to prove it. When I called Robert that evening, my voice was steady and sure. I have new evidence, I told him. Evidence that's going to change everything. What kind of evidence? The kind that's going to ensure Thomas never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a force for justice. Not just for me, but for all the women Thomas had manipulated and destroyed over the years. The war was about to become a crusade. The conference room at Robert's law firm had never felt so charged with energy. 3 weeks after Megan's visit, we'd assembled what looked like a war council. Robert, 2 associate attorneys, Megan and her lawyer, Olivia Barnes, who'd flown in from Denver, and Natalie Palmer, who'd driven down from Philadelphia. I looked around the table at these women I'd never met before, but who shared an experience I understood all too well. Each of them had been carefully selected, manipulated, and discarded by my husband. Each had been convinced they were participating in an ethical arrangement between consenting adults. Each had discovered too late that they'd been pawns in Thomas's twisted game. Ladies, Robert began, spreading out a timeline chart that covered the entire conference table. What we have here isn't just evidence of adultery. This is evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud, manipulation, and psychological abuse spanning nearly a decade. Olivia leaned forward, studying the timeline. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed with the kind of controlled composure that came from years of executive boardrooms. I had no idea there were others, she said quietly. Thomas made me feel like I was the only person who'd ever understood him outside his marriage. That's exactly what he told me, Natalie added. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with an artist's hands that trembled slightly as she pointed to her section of the timeline. He said his marriage was basically over, that you two were just going through the motions until you could afford to divorce properly. Megan nodded grimly. Same story he told me, word for word in some cases. I studied the timeline, seeing my marriage laid out in black and white alongside Thomas's betrayals. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Each affair had followed the same script, the same manipulation tactics, the same careful construction of lies. Here's what makes this particularly insidious, Robert continued, pointing to specific dates. Thomas wasn't just cheating, he was using each affair to justify escalating abuse at home. Look at the timeline of Emily's recordings. He pulled out transcripts of some of the conversations I'd recorded. Every time Thomas started a new relationship, the psychological abuse at home intensified. It's as if having an affair gave him permission to treat his wife even worse. Because it did, I said, understanding flooding through me. He felt justified in his cruelty because he'd convinced himself I deserved it. After all, if these other women found him charming and desirable, the problem had to be with me. Robert's associate, Lisa Chen, pulled out another set of documents. But here's where it gets even worse. We found evidence that Eleanor and Jessica weren't just enabling Thomas's affairs. They were actively recruiting his victims. The room went silent. What do you mean? Recruiting, Olivia asked. Lisa opened a laptop and projected an image onto the wall. It was a screenshot of a social media group called Marriage Support Network. Eleanor created this private Facebook group 3 years ago, Lisa explained. On the surface, it appears to be a support group for women having marital difficulties. But look at the member list. She clicked through several profiles. Natalie, you were a member of this group in 20. Olivia, you joined in 2020. Megan, you were added in 22. I felt sick. They were hunting for vulnerable women online. It gets worse, Robert said. We've analyzed the group's activity logs. Eleanor and Jessica would identify women who posted about marital problems, particularly women whose husbands traveled frequently or who seemed isolated from their families. He clicked to another screen showing private message threads. They would befriend these women, offer support and advice, and gradually introduce the idea that sometimes marriages need flexibility to survive. They'd share stories about couples who'd found happiness through discreet arrangements. Natalie's face had gone pale. I remember Eleanor messaging me privately after I posted about feeling lonely while my husband was traveling. She was so understanding, so supportive. She told me about a friend of hers who'd found companionship with a married man whose wife was okay with the arrangement. She told me the same thing, Olivia whispered. Made it sound so mature, so civilized. Megan was staring at the screen in horror. They were grooming us, like predators groom children. That's exactly what they were doing, Robert confirmed. And once they had identified a potential target, they'd arranged for Thomas to accidentally meet her at the grocery store, at community events, always in situations that seemed completely natural. I thought about all the times Eleanor had insisted on accompanying me to social events, all the women she chatted with, while I stood silently by her side. Women I'd thought she was just being friendly to. How many women, I asked, afraid of the answer. Lisa consulted her notes. We've identified 12 women who were members of the support group and had subsequent contact with Thomas. Of those, 5 definitely had affairs with him. We're still investigating the others. 12 women, 12 marriages potentially destroyed by my husband and his family's systematic manipulation. There's something else, Robert said grimly. We found evidence that Eleanor has been running similar schemes for years, possibly decades. Before the Facebook group, she used church groups, community organizations, even PTA meetings to identify and target vulnerable women. He pulled out a bow of old letters and documents. These belonged to Thomas's father. After he died, Eleanor kept all his papers hidden among his business documents. We found correspondence that suggests he was also involved in extramarital affairs, all following the same pattern. I picked up one of the letters, dated 23 years ago. It was from a woman named Carol, thanking Eleanor for her understanding and support during a difficult time in her marriage, and expressing gratitude for Eleanor's introduction to a wonderful man who helped her remember what it felt like to be appreciated. My God, I breathed. This is generational. Eleanor learned this from watching her own husband, and then she taught it to Thomas. It's a family business, Megan said bitterly. Destroying marriages and manipulating women is literally the family business. Olivia stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Do you know what the worst part is? I actually liked her. Eleanor. I mean, after Thomas introduced us, she would call me sometimes, just to chat. She'd tell me how happy she was that Thomas had found someone who understood him, how grateful she was that I was bringing joy back into his life. She told me the same thing, Natalie said. Made me feel like I was doing something noble, helping a good man survive a difficult marriage. I remembered Eleanor's knowing smiles, the way she'd sometimes pat my hand sympathetically after Thomas had been particularly cruel. She was getting satisfaction from both sides. I realized she enjoyed watching Thomas hurt me, and she enjoyed befriending the women he was using to justify that hurt. Robert nodded grimly. Eleanor Wilson is a psychological predator. She feeds on the destruction of other women's lives and relationships, and she's been doing it for decades. What can we do about it? Megan asked. I mean, legally, can we stop her from doing this to other women? We're building a case for criminal conspiracy and fraud, Lisa explained. The fake social media profiles, the forged documents, the systematic targeting of vulnerable women, it all adds up to a pattern of criminal behavior. But more than that, Robert added, we're going to make sure everyone knows what they've been doing. Every woman in that support group, every community organization Eleanor has been involved with, every church and social club, they're all going to learn exactly what kind of predators they've been harboring. I looked around the table at these women who'd been victimized by my husband and his family. Despite everything they'd been through, they were here, so willing to fight back, willing to expose the truth, even though it meant reliving their own pain and humiliation. There's something I need to tell all of you, I said. Something I've been thinking about since we started uncovering all of this. The room grew quiet. I spent 12 years making excuses for Thomas's behavior. I told myself he was just going through a difficult phase, that his mother's influence was temporary, that if I just loved him enough, everything would get better. I paused, gathering my courage. But the truth is, I knew something was wrong before I caught him cheating. I knew the way he and his family treated me wasn't normal. I just chose to ignore it because it was easier than facing the reality that my marriage was built on manipulation and abuse. Natalie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That doesn't make any of this your fault. I know that now. But I need you all to understand something. Thomas didn't become a predator because of his mother's influence, or because of some childhood trauma, or because he fell into bad patterns over time. He's a predator because he chooses to be one. Every lie he told, every woman he manipulated, every cruel thing he said to me, those were conscious choices. What are you saying? Olivia asked. I'm saying we need to stop giving him excuses. We need to stop treating this like it's some kind of tragic misunderstanding or psychological illness. Thomas Wilson is a calculating predator who systematically destroys women's lives for his own entertainment, and he needs to face consequences that match the severity of his crimes. Robert smiled proudly. That's exactly the approach we're taking. Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica are going to face both criminal and civil consequences. But more than that, we're going to make sure their methods are exposed so completely that no other woman will ever fall for their manipulations again. Megan looked around the table with determination in her eyes. What do you need from us? Everything, Robert said. Every text message, every email, every conversation you remember, every lie they told you, every manipulation they used. We're going to document it all and present it to the world. As the meeting broke up, I found myself standing with the three women who'd been my husband's other victims. We were strangers brought together by betrayal and manipulation. But looking at them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt sisterhood. Real, honest connection with people who understood exactly what I'd survived. Thank you, I said to each of them, for coming forward, for being willing to fight back, for helping me realize I wasn't crazy or oversensitive or any of the other things they tried to convince me I was. Thank you for having the courage to start this, Olivia replied, for refusing to let them get away with it. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the network of lies and manipulation that had controlled my life for so many years. Thomas, Eleanor, and Jessica had built their whole world on the systematic destruction of other people's happiness. They'd turned cruelty into an art form and manipulation into a family tradition. But now their victims were fighting back, and we weren't fighting alone. We were fighting together, armed with the truth and determined to make sure no other woman would suffer what we'd suffered. The predators had finally met their match, and we were just getting started. 6 months after that night when Thomas spat in my face, I stood in the courthouse watching him being led away in handcuffs. The judge had just sentenced him to 18 months in prison for conspiracy to commit identity theft, fraud, and systematic harassment. Eleanor had received 2 years. Jessica got 15 months. But more satisfying than the prison sentences was watching their entire world crumble. In the months leading up to this day, the local newspaper had run a series of articles about the marriage manipulation network, as they dubbed it. Every detail of their systematic predation had been exposed: the fake support group, the decades of targeting vulnerable women, the psychological warfare they'd conducted against their victims. All of it was now public knowledge. Thomas had lost his job within days of the story breaking. Daniel Carter had made sure of that, using his considerable influence to ensure that no accounting firm in the state would hire him. Eleanor's church had quietly asked her to stop attending services. Jessica's employer, a family counseling center, had terminated her immediately for conduct incompatible with our mission of supporting healthy relationships. But the social consequences, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to the civil judgments. Megan, Olivia, Natalie, and I had filed a joint lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and fraud. The settlement had been substantial enough to ensure that none of us would ever have to worry about financial security again. More importantly, it had funded something I'd never imagined I'd be part of creating. Emily, Robert appeared beside me as the courthouse emptied. The reporter from Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up interview. Are you up for it? I nodded. Over the past few months, I'd become something I'd never expected to be: an advocate. A voice for women who'd been systematically manipulated and abused by people who were supposed to love them. The interview took place on the courthouse steps, with a reporter asking questions I'd answered dozens of times by now. But I never got tired of telling the story, because each time I told it, another woman somewhere recognized her own experience and realized she wasn't alone. "Mrs. Anderson," the reporter asked, "what would you say to women who might be experiencing similar manipulation in their own relationships?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women who might be watching, women who were living the life I'd escaped from. "I'd tell them that love shouldn't make you smaller," I said. "Real love doesn't require you to apologize for existing, or to accept cruelty disguised as honesty, or to make yourself invisible to keep the peace. If the people in your life are systematically destroying your self-worth, that's not love, that's abuse." After the interview, I drove to my new house. Not an apartment anymore, but a real house with a garden and windows that let in actual sunlight. It was smaller than the house I'd shared with Thomas, but it was entirely mine, chosen by me, decorated according to my taste for the first time in 12 years. Megan was waiting on my front porch with a bottle of champagne and a folder full of papers. "It's official," she said, holding up the documents. "The Anderson Awareness Foundation is now a registered nonprofit organization. We decided to formalize our advocacy work, creating a foundation that would help other women recognize and escape from systematic manipulation." Megan had used her settlement money to fund it, and Olivia and Natalie had both committed to serving on the board of directors. "How many women have contacted us this week?" I asked as we settled in my living room. 47, Megan said, consulting her notes. "3 of them are situations we think might require immediate intervention, and we got a call from a prosecutor in Ohio who thinks she's identified a similar network operating in Cincinnati." It turned out that the Wilson family's methods weren't unique. Across the country, there were other predators using similar tactics to systematically destroy women's lives. Our foundation was helping to identify and expose them one case at a time. My phone rang and I saw Olivia's name on the screen. "Emily, turn on channel 12 right now," she said without preamble. "You need to see this." I grabbed the remote and switched channels. The evening news was showing footage of a woman being arrested outside what looked like a community center. The reporter was explaining that she'd been running a support group that was actually a front for targeting vulnerable women for manipulation and exploitation. "That's exactly what Eleanor was doing," Megan breathed. "Same tactics, same predatory behavior." "She probably learned it from Eleanor," I replied. "Or someone like her. These techniques get passed around, shared among predators like some kind of twisted knowledge base." The news story continued, explaining that the arrest had come about after several women had recognized the patterns described in recent media coverage of the Wilson case and contacted authorities. "We're making a difference," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine pride in what we'd accomplished. Later that evening, after Megan had gone home, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. It had been exactly 1 year since I'd first discovered Thomas's affair. 1 year since I'd begun the process of reclaiming my life. The woman I'd been then frightened, broken, convinced that her worth depended on other people's approval felt like a stranger to me now. I'd thought that woman was weak, that she'd somehow deserved the treatment she'd received. But I understood now that she'd been strong in ways I'd never appreciated. She'd survived years of systematic psychological torture and still retained enough sense of self to recognize when something was wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Saw the news about the Ohio arrest. We're really doing this, aren't we? We're actually changing things." I typed back, "We're just getting started." And it was true. The Anderson Awareness Foundation was already working with law enforcement agencies in 6 states, helping them identify and prosecute similar networks. We created educational materials for counselors, social workers, and clergy to help them recognize the signs of systematic manipulation. We'd established a confidential hotline for women who thought they might be victims. Most importantly, we'd refused to be ashamed of what had happened to us. Instead of hiding our experiences, we'd turned them into weapons against the people who tried to destroy us. A year ago, I'd been a woman whose husband spat in her face while his family applauded. Tonight, I was a woman who'd brought down a network of predators and was working to ensure that no other woman would suffer what I'd suffered. The transformation still amazed me sometimes. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden next door. She was an elderly woman who'd become something of a friend over the past few months, often stopping by with homemade soup or just to chat. "How did the court proceedings go today?" she called over. "Justice was served." I replied, sighing. "Finally." She nodded approvingly. "Good. That family got exactly what they deserved." It was a sentiment I'd heard from dozens of people over the past few months. Far from being ostracized for exposing Thomas's crimes, I'd found myself embraced by a community that was horrified by what the Wilson family had been doing in their midst. The women from Eleanor's church had reached out to apologize for not recognizing what was happening. Several of Thomas's former colleagues had contacted me to share their own suspicions about his behavior that they'd never felt comfortable voicing before. Even Daniel Carter, Megan's ex-husband, had contributed a substantial donation to our foundation, saying he wanted to help prevent other men from being victimized by these schemes. Because that was another thing we'd learned: Thomas's affairs hadn't just destroyed the lives of his female victims. They'd also devastated the husbands of those women, men who'd lost their marriages and often their children because of the Wilson family's manipulations. As darkness fell, I went inside and made myself dinner. A simple meal, but one I'd chosen and prepared exactly the way I liked it. Such a small thing, but for years I'd cooked only what Thomas and his family preferred, adjusting my taste to accommodate theirs until I'd almost forgotten what I actually enjoyed eating. Now I knew I liked spicy food, exotic flavors, dishes that Eleanor would have dismissed as too ethnic or too complicated. I liked trying new recipes, experimenting with ingredients I'd never been allowed to use in my old kitchen. I liked being myself, fully and unapologetically. After dinner, I opened my laptop and began working on my book. The Marriage Trap: How to Recognize and Escape Systematic Manipulation would be published next year, with all proceeds going to the foundation. My editor thought it could reach hundreds of thousands of women who needed to hear this message. The first chapter began with the night Thomas spat in my face, but the rest of the book was about so much more than that moment of ultimate humiliation. It was about the years of subtle conditioning that had led to that moment: the systematic erosion of my self-worth, the careful isolation from friends and family, the gradual rewriting of reality that had made me question my own perceptions. Most importantly, it was about the process of fighting back the months of secret preparation, the careful documentation of a boss, the building of a support network, the legal battle, and finally the creation of something positive from the wreckage of my marriage. As I wrote, I thought about all the women who would read these words, women who were living in situations similar to what I'd escaped from, women who'd been convinced they were crazy, oversensitive, or impossible to please, women who'd lost themselves so completely they weren't sure who they were anymore. I wanted them to know what I'd learned: that they weren't crazy, that their perceptions were accurate, that they deserved better. I wanted them to understand that love shouldn't hurt, that family shouldn't be a weapon, that they had the right to exist without apologizing for taking up space. And I wanted them to know that if they were ready to fight back, they wouldn't be fighting alone. At midnight, I closed the laptop and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, I had 3 phone interviews with women who'd contacted our foundation, a meeting with a prosecutor in Virginia, and a conference call with our board of directors about expanding our services. But tonight, I was just Emily Anderson, a woman who'd reclaimed her life from people who tried to steal it, a woman who'd turned her pain into purpose, her victimization into victory. As I turned off the lights and settled into my own bed in my own house, I thought about that night 1 year ago when I'd walked away from Thomas's saliva on my face. I'd had no idea then what I was walking toward. I was walking toward freedom, toward purpose, toward a life where I mattered, where my voice was heard, where my existence was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. I was walking toward myself, and I'd never been happier to arrive. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below and don't forget to check out two other stories that are channel favorites.